Hey there everybody and welcome back. For those of you that are looking to learn more about doing HTTP requests or setting up these data resources in Appgyver, stay tuned. I'm covering the basics in today's video. Now before we get started, don't forget to like and subscribe and check out the channel for new content. Alright, so jumping straight in, we are just going to be doing the basics, kind of high-level overview of how to use this, the functionality, things of that nature. Now, the app I'm working with is a chat app that I built, and I have this set up for free, so if you want, you can download it and import it into Appgyver. If you're interested, you can go over to codelessfix.com. Under the Codeless Apps section, there's free downloads, and there are a couple of different apps that I've made, and you can download the zip file and import it into Appgyver, and then view the relevant video tutorials on those apps. So let's go ahead and jump into the API, how to use this, things of that nature. So what we'll do first is we're going to go through the process of making sure that we actually have something to connect to. So in this case, I have a free version or free account on Firebase. The idea here at a high level is just that we have collections, documents, and then fields. We're going to keep it very simple. So think of these collections as a folder, and then the documents are folders within those folders, and then the fields are basically just the information contained within. So you can name these whatever you want. So if these names seem kind of odd, it's because it's based on how the chat app works. But to keep it simple, we'll focus on this folder here. So we have profiles. These are a list of usernnames. Each document is a username. And within that is just the field username. So what we're going to do to show how this data is structured is we're going to show how you can just get this online. So you would want to set up your own sample database for this, but in this case, we have profiles here, and we can access this page through the internet. So we would use a URL kind of like this, which is what you would do when you're doing a GET request or a POST. You're basically grabbing all of this data. So the idea here is you'll see we have the majority of our URL here, and then you'll see we have exactly what we're looking at on the other screen, but the format just looks a lot different. So you'll see we have fields, which is basically saying here are all the fields. We have the field username, and it is the string value 123. You'll see we have created an update time, and then you'll see this repeats for 1234 and 12345. Now if this seems confusing, let's take a look here. You'll see we have profiles 123, 1234, and 12345. So in this case, you'll see we have the URL here has the document name in the profiles section, and then the value here. So that corresponds to the document name, the profile section, and the value here. So the general idea is if we're calling and we're saying give me everything in profiles, you'll see we have all three of those usernames. Now if we wanted to be specific, we could say /123, and then we would be grabbing what's in this area in 123, which should just be this field here. So when we look at what's returned, you'll see in brackets, we're going to have the name and then that URL, the fields, username, string value, and then the created and update time. Now, usually when we're using Appgyver, we just need this portion here encapsulated in brackets. The rest of it's not really relevant for most of the work that at least I do. So to give you an example of how this works, we can use this sample app here. So let's see it in progress. If we were to post a username, so we want to do a post method, let's see how that works. We have profiles here. So if we wanted to say, I'm going to go to the My Account page, and I want my username instead to be 12. So we'll click Set Username, and you'll see changes saved. And now we have 12. And it just has that username here. And now, if we change this, you'll see we find that exact same bit of data here. So as you're seeing, we're able to send that data. So we'll walk through what sending looks like, because retrieval is basically the exact same in a sense. It's actually a little bit more simple. So in Appgyver, we have our marketplace. So you can go to the marketplace and find the HTTP request right here. And when you click it, you can click install. and it should appear in the installed section. Now this window here is basically your logic section. This is separate from the components here. So the logic basically says what the components or pages or whatever does. So if we click on set username and click button 2, I'm ignoring all the logic that's off to the left because it can be kind of complex, and we're just focusing on the data request that I've dragged over and a toast message. So when this button is clicked, we're going to do this HTTP request. So this is the first way to do it in Appgyver, and the main portion of the video. I'm not going into as much detail on the data tab. So for the HTTP request, you'll see first up we have a URL. Basically, where are we sending data or where are we getting data? So that would be something like this right here. So if we wanted to send data, usually you can just use a formula, and you can make the URL static or dynamic. It's really whatever works for you. So for example, you'll see here, I have the first half of the URL. And if we go to this page here, you'll see that matches up with what we have here all the way up to projects. And then we have the app variable for project. And what that's doing is allowing the user to specify whatever the project is here. And then you'll see we have the other half up to profiles, which is what we have here. And then the final piece is what's the document name. So in this case, we've added this because for Firebase, this is saying make this new document. And then it's just specifying the username. So let's put all of this together. Basically what this is doing is it's saying to this URL, create a document with whatever the user puts in this box, which is why the document came in named 1.2. That's what we specified right here. Now, you may be wondering, what about the information that's being passed through? Well, you have a couple of additional options. First, you have your advanced section to name this, and that's just really assigning a name over here. But what you're going to be working with is the HTTP method, and most of the time this is either going to be post, get, or delete. Delete is pretty straightforward, as you would imagine. It's deleting information. The put and patch aren't as relevant for most people, and they can be a bit tricky. But post is basically just saying, send out this data. Get is saying, get the data. So the example here, we are doing a post, and we're doing it to this URL. And headers is where you would specify, basically you can choose from these options, but most of the time you'll use a custom list. And this is where you would put your value in your header. For example, sometimes you may see something like people wanting authorization and then an API key, and that would usually be random letters and numbers. So in this case, I would say something like authorization, and then I would specify the API key. Usually when you're setting up your APIs or using other services, they'll tell you what headers need to come through. And I'll walk through a quick trick to help you with diagnosing and troubleshooting issues as well for this. So your headers, again, they'll be specified by whatever application that you're using. I don't need them for Firebase because right now I'm using open rules, so there's no security, but I do not recommend that. Now, before we continue, I do want to make sure that I highlight, make sure that you're following any and all applicable laws, rules, regulations, guidelines, etc. when sending, receiving, or managing data or anything like that. So now let's go into the request body. I personally like using a formula, and I'll show you how this is set up because this may look a little odd, and it primarily because it looks like a bunch of brackets, random spacing, and just text. So we'll break this down. This should look a little bit familiar. So we'll go over to this page here, and you'll see we have fields, username, string value. So basically we have this content here. So if we were to paste this in so that it's right next to what we just had, so this is what was here before, and this is the new content. If we wanted it to match, all we're really doing is adding in a bracket and another bracket, and then we're just specifying what this string value is. Other than that, the two are identical. So it's saying, hey, I'm sending some information. Here are the fields. And then on the left here is username. On the right is string value 1, 2. Now, if you wanted to add in another one, I can show you what those calls would look like on a different page to show you something a little bit more complex. But the general idea is normally you would follow this format and separate by commas. So this portion here is a field. Every time there's a field, you would just comma space, paste in the new field, and change out this value, which is the username here. And you would need to set this value on the other side of string value, which is the value that's being sent. So in this case, the string value is assigned to pagevar's username, which is the username variable on the home screen, or on this screen here. So if we had 10 different windows, you would repeat the process that we just did, comma space, and then pasting in this portion, and adding in whatever you want it to be called in Firebase, and then whatever the value is. So that's the basics of posting the data. You would make that as complex as you need to. Make sure that you're utilizing the relevant options here. So we have variable types. There are some that you can't send, or some that may not work with your database. So you just need to make sure that it's configured correctly on the database and on your end. Usually using string values is a bit safer. So that would be how you would post the data. So that's sending the data just like we just did. It's just sending this value, this value, this value. Very, very straightforward, and we're specifying the URL. Now, if we wanted to send it to a different URL, then we would simply change this up here, and we would change basically this profiles text to whichever collection we want to post to. Now, it's a lot easier to use Firebase to start because it's a NoSQL database. It's pretty straightforward. This is going to need to be adjusted for whatever database you're using. So you need to specify your URL, the HTTP method, and then the request body and headers. This is not going to be the same for every database, but there could be a lot of similarities. So that's how you're going to do a post. Now, if you want to look at a more complex post and just kind of see what it looks like, we can look at something like a chat. So in this page, if I hit the send button, there's another HTTP request, which is posting to a different URL, but it looks very similar. And what it is doing is sending this request body, which instead of one item has two. It has a chat, the comma separates, and then it has the username. So in this case, you don't need the extra bracket like I was showing on the last page. You have in fields this group right here. And what it's separating is we have this bit of text, and then in brackets what that text applies to, comma, a couple spaces, this bit of text, and then in brackets what this applies to, and then we close everything out. Now, in some areas of Appgyver, when you click on a bracket, sometimes you'll be able to see what it's kind of encapsulating, but that's usually, actually that's with commas, for example. So, or not commas, with basically with, we'll show you right here. So if you type in something like sum, you'll see that we have it set up like this, and it'll show you, if you click on sum, when you're using a function, it'll highlight everything that it applies to. So if we delete some text in here and put v1, when you click on sum again, it highlights everything. So it's not necessarily the brackets, it's just the function that shows you what it's applying to. So that's basically conducting that post. That's all that there is to that. So now let's go back and do a really quick overview of get, and then we'll do a basic overview of the data section. So when we're adding a username, we do a couple of different requests. So a get request is fairly simple. It's the same thing. It's checking the URL, basically the same URL that we were just posting to, or whatever URL you specify. And then you don't have as many inputs, though you can specify if you need to. But the idea is it's basically pulling this URL and saying, hey, what exists there? And so in my case, I'm checking to see if something exists. If it does, then I want to make sure we're acting accordingly. So the general idea there is if we go to, for example, the My Account page, if I want to check if a username is available, for example, username 12, if I click check availability, you'll see username is taken. So in this case, when we click check availability, we're doing a GET request to the same URL that we have been posting to, but we're specifying the username. So it's basically the opposite of the post. We're just checking to see if it's there. In this case, it is there. So we want to make sure that we're saying, okay, you can't use that. But if we type in some other numbers and click check availability, you'll see the username is available because no record exists. So that's an example of how you could use those in combination. Then when you set the username, you're posting it and it's sending it in right here. So that's the basic overview of the node here. Now the last thing to cover is the outputs. So when you click on this section here, you'll see your outputs at port 1, outputs at port 2, and then outputs at port 3. So the easiest way to remember it is the last port is the error message, and then the first port is basically if this runs successfully, and then the middle one you need to read into it to see and learn more. But that helps you to kind of control actions based on what happens. So in this case, I'm doing a GET. If it fails with these two, I'm saying it's available. Otherwise, if the GET request returns something, I'm saying, hey, that username is taken. Now, the last thing that we're going to cover is the data tab here. So in this case, we have the chats section. Or if we want maybe a little easier, we could look into friends. It really doesn't matter which one's which, but if we go to, let's just choose profile details because this does have usernames that'll look familiar. You'll see we have a really weird looking document, name. This name that's just a bunch of random letters and numbers is tied to the UID in Firebase. So instead of saying it's weird, we'll say it's secure. So what we'll do here is we'll say we have our resource URL, which looks just like we've been doing before, but let's see what happens when we do a GET request. So when we click run test, we get this bit of information here. So let's test this out really quick and see what happens if we were to, for example, if you wanted to try to copy this. So we have this portion of the URL. So what we can do is we can go into our other page and you'll see that we have a very similar URL to what we were previously using. So we can just hit enter and you'll see this is basically all we're doing. We're grabbing all of this information in Appgyver. So it's saying we have fields, username, string values, but this is very messy. So you may be wondering, how do we simplify this? When you hit set schema from response, you'll see that it actually breaks things down so that you can then use them in your application more efficiently or easily. For example, if you want to set username, if you wanted to set a value, then you could choose something like set app variable. And then if we wanted to, we could set any app variable and let's just choose an assigned value. So if we wanted to, we can choose, once we add the data variable that we were just working with to our page, so you'll see profile details, then what we can do is we can go to set app variable and we can choose a value. And when we go to our data variables page, you'll see all the fields from the schema section we were just on. So username, this shows some username examples because we've already done a sample request. The username section shows the details outside of that, so the string value and the username. You'll see we have the fields, the create time, the majority of that call. It all depends on what you need specifically to use within your application. Now, that's the GET collection. You can also use the GET record to get more specific details. So in this case, you'll see we're specifying profile details and then the ID, which would correspond to profile details and then specifying an ID, which is just the document here. So we're just choosing to go into that folder one step further. The create record is similar to the post that we were just looking at. And then, like I said before, the put and delete you can set up. These are very, very similar, if not the same, to using this function here. The primary difference is when you're using things in this data resource or data configurator, what it's doing is allowing you to use those in the back end automatically. So like you just saw when I was trying to set this app variable and it said, are we going to set based on these values? That's because we've told Appgyver store this info to make it easier. But sometimes you need to do it on demand with a button. Now, one final thing to note is these get record collections, create records. If I'm not mistaken, this is very similar, and this is actually using the data configurator resources here. So you'll see we have these three. When we use the create record, it allows you to choose between those three. And another thing to note is if you want to create something that's a bit more dynamic in nature, like chat, you'll see when I go to get record, there's an ID here that I specify down here. This ID is going to enable you to basically pull things a little bit more dynamically, so you'll tell Appgyver what that ID is. So here's an example. If we drop in get record, you'll see we have the chats section, and we have an ID here. This ID exists because we have it right here. If you chose to remove that and the URL placeholder, then that ID would not be present and you essentially would not be able to do it. So that's the general idea there. So I hope that was useful. I hope that was helpful with helping you to better understand how to use this in Appgyver and Firebase. Again, you can get this app and others for free over at codelessfix.com. So if you have any questions, drop them in the comment box below, and I'll see you all in the next video.